Welcome to ChinaPower. I'm Bonnie Lin, your host, and in this podcast, we dissect critical issues underpinning China as a global power. Today, I'm joined by Ngor Luong, Senior Policy Analyst on the Technology and Innovation team at the U.S China Economic and Security Review Commission. She is here in her personal capacity as a researcher and not on behalf of the commission. In this episode, we will discuss China's open AI strategy, the rise of Moonshot AI's Kimi models, and implications for U.S China AI competition. Ngor, thank you for joining me.
Bonnie, thank you for having me.
So I'd like to start by asking you directly, since it's been in the news so much, did Chinese startup company Moonshot AI's Kimi K3 model surprise you? And if so, in what way? There's obviously been a lot of coverage, a lot of discussion about that, but you studied this before the recent dynamics. Was there anything that you saw in the news that really surprised you?
Yeah, absolutely. I think in some aspects it did, and in other aspects it did not. Right. What surprised me the most is that the reality of a frontier model, open model, is probably more plausible now. Right, with the release of Kimi K3, I think the general consensus is that open models are about 6 to 9 months behind closed models. But I think the AI community now will have to kind of recalibrate this assessment because of Kimi K3, and with 2.8 trillion parameters, right? Kimi K3 is the largest open model to date. And this is also a new base model as well, right? Sometimes we do see rough edges with base model. So it's really incredible to see how the Moonshot AI team improved capabilities from Kimi K2.6 to K3, right? Climbing from a 15th place to 3rd place on the Artificial Analysis Benchmark Leadership Board. But what didn't surprise me is that Chinese AI labs continue to release stronger and stronger open models. Kimi K3 came out only 3 days before, Alibaba announced that Qwen 3.8 is coming soon with open weights. It's a little bit smaller than K3, but it's still pretty impressive. And so we've seen that this month, it was Kimi K3 and Qwen 3.8. Last month it was Jipo AI's GLM 5.2. In April, it was DeepSeek's long-awaited V4. And so, we've just been seeing a Cambrian explosion of Chinese models last year, and Chinese AI labs are maintaining this momentum this year.
And Ngor, just to follow up, you mentioned that Kimi K3 has moved to the 3rd place on the AI benchmark board. Who's the top place and who's in 2nd place on that board?
So in terms of overall capabilities, right, we have a few benchmarks leadership boards that rank Kimi K3 pretty high. So the one that I mentioned is artificial analysis, puts it in 3rd place only after Claude Fable and GPT 5.6 Soul. There's also other leadership boards as well, including Wells AI Index that ranks it, 2nd place ahead of GPT 5.6 Soul, but behind Fable 5. Right, and there's a 3rd one that's even more impressive, front-end code arena. That leadership board ranks Kimi K3 first in 6 of their 7 domains. So that's kind of just an overall assessment of Kimi's capabilities.
And you also said that Kimi K3 is changing our understandings of open models, in which open models used to be viewed as 6 to 9 months behind closed models. What's the assessment now?
Yeah, I think, we're still going to have to do a lot of assessment to determine how far open models are following behind closed models. But I think, the gap now, the general consensus is that the gap now is 6 to 5 months. I think it's going to be less than that. And it's a really short timeline. We're not talking about 2 to 3 years. So with that, I think, Kimi K3 has really pushed open models into the frontier conversation, right? The idea of frontier open models now seem a bit more plausible than before. There even is a question now that everyone is asking whether to start calling Moonshot AI a frontier lab.
Could you define this a little bit more? What is the difference between a frontier lab and an open model versus a closed model?
So in the United States, our frontier labs are Anthropic and OpenAI, and sometimes Google DeepMind is also in the mix as well with their release of the models a couple months ago. The conversation around open versus closed is kind of a little bit centered around the definition of what is an open weight model. Um, so kind of like maybe a little bit of a tangent here, but when I say open models, I do often mean open weight, and weights are essentially kind of the way that a model learns from the process, how it thinks through information provided. There's another term associated with that as well, which is learn parameters of the model. The better version of an open model is open source. Open source, it's the labs would release everything from code to training data to weights. Actually, the analogy that I like to use is, open weight models are like the finished recipe. Like you can cook the dish and even modify the recipe, but you don't have everything, right? On the other hand, open source is recipe plus ingredients plus the whole kitchen, right? Where the technical folks in the AI community can really reproduce the results of the same thing that the labs did as well.
And just to be clear, when you're talking about the AI leadership benchmark boards, it's comparing the Kimi K3 to these other open weight models, or is it just comparing Kimi K3 to other models in general across the board?
It's across the board. It's a mix of proprietary models that are at the frontier and other open models that Chinese AI labs also have released. And it is a diverse ecosystem, right? In China, there are a lot more AI labs than Moonshot AI or DeepSeek that we've have heard about.
And that's a really good follow-on because I do want to ask you about China's overall AI ecosystem and to what extent are there a lot more moonshot AI startups than what we're seeing? I mean, you mentioned already some of the dynamics in the past year with, for example, Alibaba, with DeepSeek. Like how many more moonshot AI startup companies or frontier labs are there in China?
Yes, it's a very diverse one, like I said. But if you're only looking at Chinese AI labs that are building their own large models, then we have a few categories. The first categories is, Chinese tech giants like Alibaba, ByteDance, Tencent, that have set up their own frontier labs, using their revenue from their own main businesses to fund this, AI endeavor. Alibaba's lab has been really prominent in this space. They've released so many high quality models, and they now have more than 100,000 derivatives on Hugging Face. And the second category that I like to put them in is the emerging labs that are operating in the China's VC space. We call them the six AI tigers, and they are comparable to OpenAI and Anthropic in their early stages. First of all, obviously Moonshot AI, the star of the show today, right? The company is also waiting to go public this year. We also have other companies like Jipu AI. It's a Tsinghua University spinoff. Was adding to the Commerce Entity List earlier last year. Minimax, it's another AI lab based in Shanghai, and they've gotten a lot of state-backed investment. From example, Shanghai's Science and Technology Innovation Fund, which is a guidance fund. And earlier this year, Minimax actually went public on the Hong Kong Stock Exchange market and raised an impressive amount of money, the same way that I think our frontier labs are trying to do as well as they weighing when and how to go public this year. And there are other smaller labs that you probably have, the audience might not have heard of, like EAI was founded by Kai-Fu Lee, former Google and Microsoft executive who kind of wrote the book AI Superpower. I'm sure that every AI in China researcher has read. And you probably noticed that DeepSeek is not on this list of the six AI tigers. It's because they just a hedge fund spinoff that is operating outside of the traditional funding space in China. And there are also other companies as well that we started to track, including the Neo Labs, quite rare in China, but we've seen one case of a former lead architect behind, Alibaba's Quen. He had left to start his own lab, trying to raise more money to do so. And so there are just a lot of actors, right, and players in this space that are trying to compete with our U.S. frontier labs.
And from your perspective, as you're looking at this ecosystem, are there more actors in the Chinese AI ecosystem than the United States, or is it comparable? You mentioned, for example, that one of the companies that was recently listed in Shanghai raised an impressive amount of money, but you seem to imply that a number of these companies aren't operating with the same amount of money as U.S. frontier companies. Can you just give a sense of how this compares with what we're seeing in the United States?
So there are a lot of actors trying to get into this space because these AI labs in China are also being encouraged by the Chinese government to enter the open model ecosystem. But at the same time, investment in China is facing some challenges. If you were to compare that to what our frontier labs are gaining some advantages in that space, I would say overall investment is getting squeezed by both the increase of state-led funding and also the decline of dollar-dominated funds that we've seen in China. And a lot of that too is coming from some warnings that Beijing has given to the tech companies in China. We've seen that evidenced, in the case of Menace, that Beijing has told Menace not to complete the acquisition process with Meta. And so this is the environment that Chinese AI labs are operating in.
Can you expand a little about the decline of dollar-led funding? Does that mean decline of funding from the United States?
Yeah, so a number of cases that happened the last couple of years have really influenced the result that we've been seeing, which is fewer U.S. investment or foreign investment in China, just because the tech crackdown back in early in 2020s have really decreased confidence in investment in tech in China's tech community, and increased scrutiny from the Chinese government as well. We've seen that in the new regulations on outbound investment, and also just much or a decline in money coming from the private sector itself, because the state-led investment has really increased in share of the overall VC investment. I think we are reaching 80% of the overall VC investment in China has been coming from state-led investment. So that's been crowding out a lot of the private capital as well, which are mostly coming from U.S. investors.
Well, that's pretty significant. 80% of the funding that VCs have in China in the AI space are state-led. That's a lot. That also raises the issue of, does that decline in funding matter? Because I think I've seen discussion of two things. One is that a lot of these models are developed at a fraction of the cost of U.S. models, which relates to the second concern that I think more folks in the United States have, is that many of these models are in many ways either inappropriately taking IP from the United States, or they're engaging in some form of distillation. Could you weigh in on the fact that there's generally less funding in the Chinese system, but many of these companies seem to be able to operate a fraction of U.S. costs, and your sense of to what extent is China actually innovating versus just building off of or taking from existing U.S. models?
Let me just clarify real quick that the 80% number that I mentioned is an overall VC investment, not just AI, but AI is certainly it's growing share of China's investment overall. And to your question about whether we've seen more efforts, more innovation coming from Chinese AI labs versus, more efforts to kind of distill or generate outputs or generate outputs using US models to train their own models. I think that's an important and complicated issue. It is also constantly evolving as well. I think on distillation in particular, it's useful to think about what we know and what we don't know. What we know is that knowledge distillation is a common technique, right? It's also a legitimate training method as well among researchers in the AI community. XAI itself also has distilled from US frontier labs. Um, the conversation around adversarial distillation attacks has really been driven by OpenAI and Anthropic, who coined that term as well, and has released report documenting such activities. So what we know is that Chinese labs have used fraudulent accounts and proxy services to extract outputs from the more powerful teacher models, kind of often in the form of synthetic data to train the student models. And so, with that information, right, when I try to address this, I think of two questions that you raised as well. That is, are Chinese AI labs distilling US models for synthetic data? I think we've seen evidence of that, so absolutely yes. But are they producing genuine innovation? I also think the answer is yes. So it's not so black or white. We've seen evidence so far that they are doing a little bit of both, but it's very difficult to determine how big of a percentage of distillation is compared to, new techniques, new data, maybe other new innovation coming out of these labs. And so I think the bottom line here is that adversarial distillation is a whole, right, for U.S. frontier labs to patch. But I don't think it's it shouldn't be used as an excuse to not acknowledge the fact that Chinese AI labs are closing the gap, using every means they possibly can get their hands on, including, hiring smart people to build the models, trying to get investment from a lot of places, through, VCs, by going public to get more, to leverage that capital markets, and also just, coming up with new research ideas as well.
And what are your thoughts on, it seems like an increasing consensus or view in DC that the Kimi K3 is distilling or taking IP from Anthropic?
I think that's a ongoing discussion. And again, it's a very complicated topic. I think we still need to continue to do an assessment, continue to ask that question of whether we've seen outputs that potential companies like Kimi or Moonshot AI generate from our frontier models like Claude or Fable to train their model. I think the question I ask as well is, are they using the data to train for pre-training versus post-training? I think more information on that will be really helpful to determine to what extent is distillation a big part of Kimi's capabilities improvement.
And is distillation more the pre-training or the post-training?
It could be both. We have seen more evidence of that being used for post-training than pre-training. I think I'm still tracking whether that information will be more useful in the future.
Great, thank you. I want to now pivot to a paper that you wrote earlier this year, Two Loops, How China's Open AI Strategy Reinforces Its Industrial Dominance, where you discuss China's embrace of an open AI strategy. Could you unpack a bit of what this open AI strategy is and how does Kimi's K3 model fits in? And relatedly, the 6 tigers within China,
Yes.
are they all operating within this open AI strategy? Are they all producing open AI models?
The goal of the paper is to, increase education, especially within Congress as well. And the evidence shown in the paper indicates that, China's AI open model strategy is really a way for Chinese AI labs to kind of slingshot themselves into the frontier. This strategy started as an industry model to compete with the United States, and now it has been picked up by the Chinese government. We've seen that in a lot of places, including Xi Jinping's speech, right, at the recent World AI conference as well. There's a lot of support coming from the Chinese government itself to continue to promote, open model diffusion. More evidence of that, beyond speeches, they also put open model strategy in their policies. We've seen that in the most recent AI Plus initiative in the 15 5-year plan. And, to your point about the AI, the 6 AI tigers, they are all championing open model strategy. All of these companies are constantly releasing open models. In actually, like I said before, the Cambrian explosion of Chinese open models. I like to use that term because it's really the iterations of open models, the innovation ecosystem has really prompted these companies to kind of rise up collectively, right? In the paper, it noted that back in 2022 when ChatGPT came out, China only had about 30 open models. Right, but by the end of 2025, it grew to over 300 models. That is a 10x growth. And when we talk about open models, there are different levels of accessibility. Open weight models has a range of some restriction and some unrestrictions licensing access. And China, by all means, has more open model, unrestricted models than United States. So that just means that you can do whatever you want with the model once you download it. And this really, it's really important for the Chinese AI ecosystem because, like I said before, the interaction within that broader ecosystem has really allowed them to build on top of each other, allow them to really see what architecture is working, what are the research they need to continue to work on.
This might just be a more basic question that most folks might know, but are open models competitive and lucrative enough? It seems to me like, and this is again coming from a person who's not that well versed on the tech side, it seems to me that if you are behind in the technology innovation, you probably want to be releasing open models to show your progress. But if you are ahead, is there an advantage of making sure that your model is proprietary? Could you just walk me through what are the advantages for any individual company at the frontier edge to have an open model versus a proprietary model?
Yeah, absolutely. You're absolutely right on, the followers tend to open up their models. We've seen that in the US as well. Meta used to do that when it was, trying to match its capability to Anthropic and OpenAI. And in China, it's not a different strategy, right? But we've seen that the scale in China much larger than the global ecosystem. And open models is as an economic strategy for these Chinese AI labs is a working one because for them to compete with U.S. frontier models, the goal is to really showcase what they're capable of, and by allowing other developers to download their models, those developers can test and figure out what is really working, and what are still the gaps, right, for them to close. And so by just showcasing their capabilities, and allowing other people to build on top of their models, they are trying to make their models the default mode, right, for AI development. And that is, in a sense, has been working because in the United States, there are a number of companies who have come out and said Chinese models are cheap and their capabilities are comparable to US models. Companies like Airbnb, the CEO has said, they are using Qwen to integrate. They integrated Qwen into their AI chatbot. Other companies like Cursor and Lindy AI, smaller companies, are also using Kimi and DeepSeek to integrate into their enterprise system as well. So I think that is kind of some anecdata to really show that this is a strategy that Chinese AI labs is employing.
Currently, are you seeing any leading Chinese frontier AI labs making the case that some of their models should be proprietary? What is their view on when they need to go the proprietary route or have a closed model?
Yeah. So in the paper, there is a graph that I encourage everyone to look at as well that shows a mixture of both open and closed models in both the Chinese ecosystem and the U.S. ecosystem. The crucial point here is that in China's AI ecosystem, they lean a bit more on open models. So companies like Alibaba still releases proprietary models alongside of their open models. I think this year, Alibaba released about 4 proprietary models so far, alongside many other open models as well. So it's a mix of both, but again, a bit more in favor of open models. I think that's the point of this competition between United States and China right now.
And your paper focused on 2 loops, right? One refers to the digital loop of adoption, innovation, and the second is the physical loop of deployment and data generation. Could you just unpack this a bit for our folks who may or may not have time to read your paper? What is the key takeaway, and how do these 2 loops drive China's ecosystem?
A digital loop just means that it's a feedback loop system of innovation and rapid community-driven iteration that we've seen in the open model space, and not just in China, but just globally, historically as well. And on the other hand, a physical loop is one that involves kind of large-scale deployment across different sectors like manufacturing, logistics, robotics, and these iterations continue to generate like real-world data to improve AI capabilities, right? I said real-world data. I meant, it's the internet data has becoming more and more finite because we are, utilizing these data faster than we can generate it. And so what Chinese AI labs are trying to do is that they are trying to look for other ways to incorporate other valuable data into their training. So, real world physical data is very something that has been underutilized in recent years. And so, in this digital loop, to go back to it, like I said before, Chinese open models are trying to reach the frontier, but they are behind U.S. proprietary models, partly because of the lack of compute. Our export controls policy has really put China in a compute constrained environment, and they are not able to scale as fast as U.S. frontier labs. It's part of the scaling laws. It's really capital intensive to utilize to get access, to NVIDIA chips, to continue to invest in the infrastructure that supports that kind of large scale capacity. And like I said before, we do have the policy to address the digital loop. What we haven't really looked closely into is the physical loop, that is deployment of small specialized models to acquire data to then feed it back into the model for further iteration, right? This physical loop is where models get adopted into the physical economy. And a physical economy, things like manufacturing, logistics, that are generating real economic values. And China has really been pushing aggressively in the what we call embodied AI at the moment. That is a combination of cognitive functionings of large language models with physical AI that allows the models to interact with real world.
I think another, maybe for those who are less well-versed, my understanding of embodied AI is really the AI plus the robots, right?
Absolutely,
basically
yes.
giving a physical body to this AI model. Can you give an example of both the digital loop and the physical loop, and maybe one company that has been able to use the real world physical data and incorporate that back into its training?
So, the two loops don't operate in silo. Where they converge is when Chinese open models are being fine-tuned to become small, cheap, specialized models for very specific tasks and real-world deployment as well. So one example that we showed in the paper is a team, a interns robotics team at Shanghai's AI lab that has adapted Alibaba's Quinn's model to build their own models called Intern VLA M1. And this model is a derivative of Quinn, but it uses robotics data uh, for that fine tuning, right? To make sure that a language model or a multimodal models can be translated for physical use. So an example of this, a bit more theoretical, is a concept that combines large language models with world models to create that physicalness of a AI system. So what I mean by that is language models, as everyone is familiar with, is really good at decomposition. Is really good at assigning information, across different domains, but it cannot, be connected to interact with the real world. So what scientists would do, researchers would do, is combine a large language models with a world model that can really take the task compositions and translate that into real world interaction. Right, with say, you pick up a pen, the language model says, and give that instruction, pick up the pen, but the world model says, take, a extended arm of the robot and, decrease, lower that arm by 3 centimeters and whatnot, or feet, right? And bring it back up and move it to a desired spot. So that's kind of like a theoretical explanation of how two different types of model can be merged into one to translate instructions into physical reality.
And what did you call the combination of these two models?
Physical AI.
Oh, okay. So is this a way in which LLMs are combining with world models into this physical AI model? Do we have that in the United States too? Like, is this unique to the Chinese ecosystem, or is China just investing a lot more in this than the United States?
We absolutely do have that in the United States. NVIDIA, has, if I remember correctly, has a version of this, and obviously Tesla, which is in the autonomous driving sector, there are a lot of companies that are trying to experiment with this. Um, the difference is that the scale and scope of that experimentation in China has been taken seriously, and also is also bigger as well. And I haven't even gotten to the point about data generation. There's a lot of efforts coming from the Chinese government to standardize data collection and aggregation for robotics sector.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Nora. I do want to wrap up the podcast by looking at some of the implications of what we're seeing in China for the United States. So just going back to what kicked off the podcast, looking at Moonshot AI, maybe in terms of big picture, from your perspective, are Chinese firms really closing the gap with leading U.S. AI companies across the board?
I think the evidence that we observed so far would indicate so.
And what does closing that gap mean? Like, how much of a gap is there left? A couple of months only, or more than that? What's your best sense?
The conversation around whether Chinese models are closely following behind U.S. frontier models is an important one, and the assessment, is critical to understanding what does it mean for the United States to compete with China and vice versa. We've seen that Kimi's K3's close to frontier capabilities might have the potential to give, Chinese AI ecosystem like government, companies, and investors even more confidence that open models is a working strategy for the entire nation. And so we might see more support financially and politically for open models in China. And now, in the scenario where Chinese open models matches the capabilities of U.S. frontier proprietary models, that is something that going to have long-term repercussion. Because if developers believe that they can easily download models and pay at a cheaper price than they would if they were to use closed models, then we might see more proliferation of derivatives. Derivative meaning the models that are fine-tuned of the base models. Then we might see more developers defaulting to Chinese companies and Chinese models. I think this is the world that we don't really want to live in from the United States perspective because of a number of reasons, right? This means that China can really compete with us economically, maybe strategically as well, and also in third markets, right? Globally, where the diffusions of Chinese open models can really serve as a way for Chinese AI companies to compete with US companies and lock them out of competitions in third markets. And if they make their open models the default models for a lot of for the rest of the world, then it's safe to say that it's more of a soft power points, like more points of soft powers for the Chinese government.
And you had referenced Xi Jinping's speech at the World AI Conference. Is that from your perspective, is that a main goal for China to proliferate its open models and challenge U.S. dominance? Like, if that happens, in addition to countries, using Chinese AI models, what are some of the national security risks that you see?
Yeah, absolutely. I would absolutely say so. And not beyond Xi Jinping, we have also seen that Chinese AI labs themselves, including the CEO of Jipu AI or Z.ai, have said that he hopes that Chinese models becomes the default of innovation globally. So this is the sentiment is coming from both government and companies. So the risk related to dependency, concerns areas where wide adoption of Chinese AI models can really create potential infrastructure vulnerabilities, right, including embedded censorships and maybe potential cybersecurity backdoors, right, similar to the concerns that we've seen around connected ICT products that are exported from China. And I do want to, really note that these are ongoing debates and ongoing concerns that deserves more scrutiny and deserve more attention, especially in terms of technical assessments of these models, so that we can understand how widespread and how deep of a cybersecurity risk this is. And in particular, in terms of in terms of censorship risk, as we know that Chinese models operate under really strict censorship laws in China, these risks, would potentially get exported out to the rest of the world alongside the models as well.
Fascinating. So in many ways, the models are able to propagate China's views to the third world, whether that's due to censorship, and there's of course debate whether these models could be used for more nefarious purposes. But again, as you mentioned, this is an area that we need to continue to watch, and there's no conclusive evidence either way yet. And probably because Chinese models are still, in many ways, a long way from being dominant, or the dominant model in the global south or in third countries.
Absolutely, and they are still new phenomenon. So as more models are coming out, I believe that the AI community will continue to test and determine the viability of these models.
Excellent. Well, thank you, Nor, for joining me for this fascinating discussion on what is happening with Moonshot AI's Kimi K3 model, assessing the Chinese AI open model ecosystem, as well as sharing concerns of if Chinese models were to proliferate. Thank you for joining me for this very excellent in-depth discussion.
Thank you for having me.